Good evening, friends. This will be this continuing series of Debunking Catholicism and Love, and this will be part 2. This will be debunking this well-known heresy in the Catholic Church that Peter is the rock that Jesus refers to in Matthew 16, but we're going to dissect that, and we're going to find out very quickly and clearly that Jesus wasn't referring to Peter as the rock, but the confession of Jesus being the Christ, Son of God, the confession. Jesus is was planning to build his church on the confession of Peter saying, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." Now, so there's two other passages of Scripture we're going to look at that clearly make the case that it just doesn't make any sense. When you look at this in context, for Peter being the rock and not Jesus. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start with the passage that Catholics will use for Peter being the rock upon which the church is built. Okay, so here we go. Matthew 16, starting at verse 13. So, starting at 13, this is the King James Version, the New King James Version, rather. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea and Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "What do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, Son of the living God." And Jesus answered, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever be bound on earth will be blessed." And he commanded his disciples that no one should tell anyone that Jesus was the Christ. Now, so remember, he said, "I'm going to," and on this rock. He never said Peter was the rock. So now, and then a few verses later, Peter rebukes Jesus for saying he's going to get killed. But he turns and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. You are not mindful of things of God, but of the things of men." So Peter was the rock upon which the church was built, and Jesus calls him Satan. Well, Jesus was not really calling Peter Satan, but that Satan was being used as a mouthpiece. Peter was being used as a mouthpiece for Satan in the same chapter. Okay, here's another reason it doesn't make sense that Peter was the rock on which Jesus built his church. Let's see here. I think it's Matthew 7. Therefore, this is Matthew 7. This is Jesus concluding his famous Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, whoever hears, this is Matthew 7, starting at 24. Jesus concluding the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, whoever hears these words of mine, that means the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount, and puts them into practice, I will liken that man to a wise man who built his house on what? The rock. Whoever hears his words of mine does not put them into practice, I will liken him to a foolish man who built his house on the sand. So Jesus is the rock, and building your life on Jesus as the foundation of your life. So Jesus is, remember, I think it's Paul who calls Jesus as the chief cornerstone, right? So Jesus is the rock, firm foundation, chief cornerstone. You can use all these kind of analogies, but Point is, Peter is not the rock. Okay, there's one more passage of scripture. I should have looked this up first, but I think this is. Give me a moment here. Okay. Okay, maybe I'll link it in the description when you find it. But basically, it's when it's a story when disciples are out fishing, they haven't caught anything all night, and then Jesus comes along and tells them, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. And then Peter's kind of reluctant. He's like, come on, we've been out here all night. And then he casts it in the night, and then when they pull it in, the nets are starting to tear because the weight of the catch is too much for the nets to sustain. And then Peter realizes right quickly that, obviously it's a miracle because there's no other explanation. Because there was no fish. Like, obviously, it's only a matter of a few feet in distance between one side of the boat and another. So obviously, Jesus makes the fish come to the net, like he orders them. So only God can do something like that. So, and Peter, after this happened, he's fearful. He says to Jesus, "Depart from me, Lord, for I'm what? I'm a sinful man." Now, yeah, I'm gonna link that in the description when I post this, because I can't find it off the top of my head, and I don't want to waste time on this video looking for it more than I have. So, suffice to say, it would make absolutely no sense for Jesus to build his church on Peter. It wouldn't make no sense for Peter being the rock of that church because Peter's a sinful man. So why would Jesus put the foundation, the core of the church, build it on a sinful man? Now, I'm not saying you can build around his teachings, but Jesus wouldn't build on Peter as the foundation of the church because Peter is a self-confessed sinful man, which is true. Now, here's the other thing that doesn't make sense about this, right? Remember, disciples had all kinds of interesting discussions, and one of those being, who was the greatest among them? So, don't you think it would be a little strange for Peter, who had the biggest mouth of all the disciples at the time that we know of, would have kept something like that to himself? And when they had this greatest discussion, he'd be like, "Hey guys, remember, we're in Caesarea and Philippi. Jesus said, 'I'm the rock.'" You really think that Peter would have kept that to himself? I don't think so. Disciples were just regular guys. Fishermen, tax collectors, they're just... maybe tax collectors was a little bit unusual, but they were untrained men in pretty much every respect. And they were also very young. Most people date the disciples to be probably between 15 and 25 years of age. So, obviously a lot of naivety and ignorance along with that. Especially if they're in their teenagers. But my point is, nothing about Peter being the rock fits with the context of Scripture as a whole. So first of all, it wouldn't make sense because Peter is a self-confessed sinful man, and I'm going to link that passage in the description. So you can find it there. But also, you've got Jesus, he says he likens people who have listened to those words of his teachings. And so if you listen to what I'm saying and you apply that, you're a wise man, building your house upon the rock. What's the rock? Me. I'm the rock. Build your life on me. Jesus is the firm foundation. Secondly, Peter's is again a self-confessed sinful man. So it would not make any sense whatsoever for Jesus to build his church on Peter being a sinful man. Now, I'm not saying that Peter was a legitimate apostle, and he was one of the pillars of the church. No question about that. But he was also, like, man, remember, a self-professed sinful man, which was true. But it wouldn't make any sense for Jesus to build his church on the life of a sinful man. And finally, remember, once again, remember one of those discussions among many that the disciples had was who was the greatest among them. Now, again, Peter was, from what we know of Peter, he was pretty hot-headed, hotshot, thought pretty highly of himself. I mean, the guy thought that he was never going to deny Jesus, and then what did he do? Denied Jesus 3 times. So it's very safe to say that if Peter thought that Jesus meant that he was the rock on which Jesus was going to build his church, you can be certain that he would have told the 11 disciples when they had that conversation about who was the greatest among them. And I believe that actually was in Matthew 18. Let me check that for a second. I believe it was Matthew. So it wasn't too long before that scenario between Peter and Jesus. I see, Matthew 18. At that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest among the kingdom?" So, again, and this is only 2 chapters later, but also keep in mind, remember, later in Matthew 16, Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me," because, again, so he wasn't speaking to Peter so much as that Peter was being a mouthpiece for Satan when he said, "I'm going to prevent you from dying." Because Jesus obviously had to die. And so Peter was obviously not in line with Scripture. And so Jesus wasn't going to put up with Peter coming in the way of the plans of God. So none of it makes sense if you tally up everything I've said. Nothing about this Catholic doctrine makes sense about Peter being the rock being the rock that Jesus was referring to. No, if you look at it in context, and context is king when it comes to Scripture, that Jesus meant that he was going to build his church on the confession that Peter made of Jesus being the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is what makes most sense. It's fitting with Scripture, it's fitting with context, and it just makes sense. I mean, remember again, 3 things right about that make no sense about Jesus building his church on Peter as the rock. That Peter was a self-confessed sinful man. That Peter would have been just 2 chapters later in Matthew 18. We said, "Hey guys, remember in Caesarea Philippi? Obviously, I'm the greatest among us because I'm the rock that Jesus could build his church on." But that never happened. And Jesus refers to himself as the rock. If you look at the context of Matthew 7 and 24 to pretty much the end of the chapter. So, Jesus refers to himself as the rock. Peter's self-confessed sinful man. And Peter never brought up that he was the rock that Jesus was going to build his church upon in Matthew 18 when the disciples had this dispute and discussion about who is the greatest among them. So if you put all those things together, it just doesn't work. But Catholics will tell you that's what Jesus meant. But he didn't. And that's all I got for now. Peace out, Brother Rob.